Hi there and welcome back to another episode of A Serve of Leadership. My name's Ian Crawford. I'm a professional speaker, trainer and coach specialising in the area of leadership and influence. And the person you're seeing on the other screen is leadership consultant and coach extraordinaire, Ash Luty. Welcome back.
Rolfs, how are you, champ?
I think we're starting to get the hang of it.
Oh, mate, what are you talking about? Mate, don't undersell. Mate, don't undersell.
Episode 5, I think we're getting there.
Well, we're having good conversations and, we're getting some interest from people. So that's a win, if you ask me.
Yeah, well, we're enjoying it. so we'll see what happens from there. Hopefully it will grow. It was your turn to choose this week. What are we talking about?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Well, interesting. For me, the topic presented itself to me, I think, quite comfortably, because you and I both did a little bit of a debrief after last week's session, and we thought, you know what, there was many things that we think we failed at in last week's session. I think the conversation was good, but there were a lot of other technical glitches and challenges that we came across that probably wasn't quite to the level that we wanted. So extending on from that, I thought, well, what a great opportunity to talk about that. How do we as leaders and as organisations go about dealing with failure? So what do you reckon about that?
I think you're a wise man, and I think it comes at a very good time. I think there's a bit of a cultural shift in the whole, or any industry at the moment, where we want innovation and creativity, but we're holding on to the old ways of, if you fail, you get slapped and you get in trouble. If we go back and look at some real innovators and real change merchants across history, we find they tend to look at failure in a very particular way. And there's a great saying that I got from a guy called Thomas Watson. Probably not a lot of people know of him, but he was the CEO of IBM between 1914 and 1956.
1914 and 1956?
Yeah.
Wow, talk about doing your homework. Mate, you've really dug something out of the trenches there.
Because you know that I'm a details guy. And he basically took it from a small organisation to an international brand. One of his favourite sayings was, the fastest way to succeed is to double your failure rate. Just straight away from saying that, that's quite a interesting sort of perspective on things. But I think that over the last few years, more and more leaders are starting to really understand that if we want to get this innovative state and get creative, then failure is just part of the territory. If you're an organisation, you can't be on the cutting edge of anything, of developing processes or products, unless you're willing to be a risk taker. And with risk, sometimes failure occurs as well. And
sometimes, all the time.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And although it's easy to see the value of learning from mistakes from an organisational point of view, I think there's one major hurdle that we need to get over. It's our personal perception of what failure is. And no one likes to fail personally, because failure means embarrassment. It means loss of self-esteem, possibly perceived standing within your team, and maybe even loss of your job. It's a very interesting topic. It's very timely that you've come up with it, because I think organisations are on a pivotal edge about where they do it or how they deal with this sort of stuff. I'm excited about this one. Lead us off with a bit of a tip.
I guess the way that I look at this is similar to when we had our conversation around courageous conversations, is that it's not just in the moment. So a lot of people sort of view failure just from, okay, well, how do we deal with it in the moment? Whereas for me, when I see the really best organizations and the best leaders work in this space, they do a lot of front-end stuff beforehand. So the first one for me is this concept of focusing on feedback. And it's underpinned by this, I guess, this theory or this mindset that learning itself is the key driver. And one of the best ways around learning is through feedback. Right? And so when we have, regardless of situations, but in particular around failure situations, instead of it being a zero-sum game of, okay, well, yes, we did really well, or no, we didn't do well, is actually, well, what went well? How do we hang on to some of that, but also what do we need to do better at, right? So it's actually looking at the learning process through feedback rather than just getting caught up in the result itself. Right? And so you see a lot of that at the moment, I think you see a lot of that in the best sporting team. The absolute elite sporting teams, while having a mission that they're driving towards, are very, very feedback focused. You look at the AFL footy teams where we are in Australia, and they will play their game and they will have their debrief with their coaches, but then they'll also sit down and review their own individual tapes to see what their performance was like through a game. They will sit down with the back line and they'll break down their performance and get feedback from multiple different avenues in an ongoing basis.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, feedback is a really powerful element, and those who deal well with failure have a culture of focusing on feedback. That's my first point. What do you reckon about that?
I think that's a very good point. You're a pretty smart guy.
Well, not so much, what's your, value opinion on it. Well, how does it fit into your way of thinking? I should be more clear with my questions. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I was distracted of how well your colouring in is coming along behind you there. You're staying within the lines now. So.
What are you talking about? That's taken me 40 years to get to that level. 40 years.
It comes back to that old saying that feedback is the breakfast of champions. And breakfast is the most important meal of the day. So it really aligns with that. And adding on to that, if we look at leaders who are good at being failure tolerant, they tend to do things slightly differently in regards to their leadership style that really produces the cultural outcomes that they're looking for. And the first thing that we notice with them is they don't get consumed by the losses. But also, this is the really interesting stuff, is they also don't get overwhelmed by success. What they tend to do is not run to either end of those continuums, but what they tend to do, have a focus that's somewhere in the middle where their job isn't to completely celebrate success or absolutely go berserk over losses. It's about, okay, in regards to that dichotomy there, I want to develop an organization that focuses on somewhere in the middle, which is about developing the organizational experience they have, their knowledge and creativity from those two ends of the dichotomy. That's where their focus is. So they're a little bit more stoic. I think that's a word. Would you use that word? Stoic?
It is a real word. Yes, you have picked it.
It is a real word. Thank you.
And it's interesting. I was having a chat with a leader the other day, and he had a wonderful rule, which I love, and he calls it his rule of 24 hours.
Yep.
And extending on from what you're talking about there is, he said, with his team, he said, we are, when we have successes, he said, we've got 24 hours to drink our own Kool-Aid and talk about how wonderful we are. But then after that 24 hours, okay, what's next, right? We've got to move on to our next stage, our next challenge, our next opportunity. And he said, we use exactly the same rule for failure, right? He said, we've got 24 hours. When things go wrong, basically we give ourselves 24 hours to wallow in our own pity, to figure out how we move forward and get better. And then we're done. And then we're on to what's the next step. Yeah. I thought it was a really clever mindset.
That's very
a little
clever
tool.
But you can just imagine, it's a simple tool, but you imagine him enforcing that, in want of a better word, how wonderful of an impact that would have on his organizational culture.
Oh, absolutely.
It'd be pretty good. And leading on from that, those tips that you give us that the leaders are doing quite precisely is that, again, if we look at further along at these failure tolerant leaders, we actually find that the skills they require and the strategies they need to implement are pretty simple, but really underutilized. And here it is. You ready for this? The number one strategy they think that leaders who are failure tolerant is taking interest in their employees' projects. Now, that sounds really quite basic, but once again, it's how we approach that. Leaders tend to take an interest in their projects based on a criteria of, is it going well? Is it not going well? Whereas what they're recommending here, and in my experience and seeing other leaders do this, is their interest moves away from failure and success towards understanding the employee's work, understanding how the employees are feeling about the project, asking really great, curious questions about it, showing support, and also setting the bigger picture significance of what they do in regards to the impact on the organization. So it's more a collaborative approach rather than a managerial approach. I think I'm really cautious about saying that in regards to any of this cultural stuff that we talk about, is that this stuff takes time. And if you're going to be a leader that's going to build an organization around failure tolerance, it doesn't happen overnight. Cultural change is glacial slow, and it takes long term. You have to stick to this over and over again. And once again, if we look as history as an indicator of how people do this sort of stuff, you may have heard of a guy called Thomas Edison.
Who is he? What's he done?
Well, he did a couple of cool things, but one of the things that we do know is he failed a lot personally as an inventor. But he was, from a business owner, from a leader's point of view, he was famous for spending time with his employees and having really animated and respectful conversations with their workers. There was a quote from someone who worked for Edison for over 50 years. And the quote that this person said, he made me feel that I was making something with him. I wasn't just a workman. So it has a real collaborative feel to it. Simple tasks, but not necessarily easy to do.
Absolutely. And I guess maybe just closing out our conversation around feedback, you know, your point that you make is these things take time to develop and that it's often best invested beforehand rather than just trying to deal with it in the moment. I've been working with an exec team recently where they've actually really been trying to drive the feedback process, right? And to basically get into that habit of being able to not even just wait for feedback to come for them, but to be able to seek feedback and to seek feedback in a really consistent manner. So for them, they've even broken it down to that after each individual meeting that they have, an interaction they have, they take 2 or 3 minutes just to do a quick check-in around, hey, what did I do really well behaviorally? What could I maybe do better at? So that they're getting that constant feedback all the time. Which then, again, you sort of fast forward to crisis moments when things go wrong, things like that. You're already in that groove. You know, you've already created a bit of a learning platform to be able to, one, be better at seeking that feedback, but two, be often more prepared to receive it when it comes as well.
It's probably like a lot of stuff that we talk about. That sounds really simple when we're sitting here talking to each other.
Of course it is.
In regards to delivery, you know, for a leader to do that, they're really putting themselves out there. And they have to expect that their employees, in regards to the incident that you just gave them, might come back with an absolute whack to the side of their head they weren't expecting and be okay with that. And
that is a remarkably sickening segue into my second point anyway.
Well, I thought
looks like you knew what I was going to say. You're unbelievable.
Well, what is it? Don't keep us guessing.
I think the second one for me, again, my perspective on this is a bit more of a broader than just individual failure events. And the other one that stands out for me is something that I call transparency leadership, right? And that's where leaders really need to get comfortable sharing their weaknesses with their teams, right? So the things that they're not good at, the things that they have failed at, being comfortable enough to go first and say, hey, you know what? I actually stuffed that up. Or, look, I'm not particularly good at that. How can we build a process, a structure, have different individuals who can support that piece? Because there's a system aspect to it, but then there's also, looping back to the point you made before, there's a connection aspect to it. So by being transparent with your team about being vulnerable enough to say, hey, you know, I'm not perfect at this. I do make mistakes. I don't have strengths everywhere. Then it gives permission to your team as well to step forward with that, to understand that it's okay to make mistakes, that it's okay to not be perfect in that space. So I think that's a really powerful one. And again, looping back onto the point you made before, it's something that takes time to develop. It's not just, you know, when we're in the midst of the shit hitting the fan, so to speak, is that, you know, yeah, I'm not good at that as well. That's not the right time. It's building up to that point and having that vulnerability well beforehand to build that connection. That was my second point.
I think that's a very good point. And funny enough, my next one leads on from that as well. No, it's unbelievable, isn't it? And also links in, I think, to, or not think, I know that it links into that feedback, is that in times of failure, when things don't go the way that the organisation requires them to go, it is ultimately the leader's responsibility that it hasn't occurred. And that's not a blame thing. We've got to be careful. It's not a blame, it's a responsibility. And when leaders take responsibility, they can make change. And leaders have to fight the urge that when things don't go well, that they spin around in their big leather chair and start pointing at their workers going, well, this didn't go well and this didn't go right and you shouldn't have done this and you should have done that. Overall, and openly say, I'm the leader of the organisation. We didn't get to where we need to get to. I take full responsibility and we're going to have conversations how this never happens again. And not only does that process is the true essence of leadership, it also positively influences the culture of the organization in regards to ownership to work. You know, full extreme ownership to work, where if the leader at whatever level is willing to stand up and say that and take whatever brunt or whatever hit they're going to take, well, I can do that as well. And once we start doing that, it really sets the culture and sets the tone in regards to how we as an organization are going to respond to failure. Because as you would have experienced over and over again, just narrow it down into regards to failure, if a leader responds poorly to failure, that will influence not only how we deal with failure in the future, but also the way that people will be risk takers and be innovative in their approach. Because if they know that, hey, if I screw this up, the boss is going to go absolutely berserk, they don't do the process, let alone what happens at the end. So I'm a big fan of leaders taking extreme ownership of what they do. And we desperately need that in our world right now.
You know what? There was, I think, a really impressive example of that just recently from our Prime Minister.
Okay. E.g.?
Mate, for example, do you not pay any attention to current affairs and the news and things like that? So look, in this COVID-challenged world in Australia, the Australian government has put together a JobKeeper program, which supports employees and helps to keep people employed through these tough times. And their original forecasting through their initial numbers were that it was going to cost the government and, of course, the taxpayers about $130 billion, right, which is a fair bit of coin.
Yeah.
And then it turned out through some, let's call it accounting issues and filling out form issues, that the actual cost of the program, because less people were signed up than they originally thought, is going to come in closer to about maybe $70 billion. So a saving of $60 billion. So, of course, that's when the press wants to jump on board and say, why was there the errors and that sort of thing. And one thing that really stood out for me was Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, actually, in one of his press conferences said, you know what, I just take full responsibility over that. Right? We stuffed it up. But then he flipped it around. He goes, well, the benefit is we have a $60 billion savings. So whether you agree with it or not, I really was impressed by his approach to it. In fact, almost surprised, to tell you the truth, because you don't often see that from politicians in particular, who are often judged on their 3-minute statement that they make, or the polls that are taken on a daily basis or something like that. So I thought that was a good example of what you're talking about.
We know that you love threes. So what's your third tip?
Well, not to disappoint you, but I actually have two more.
Oh, killing me. All right, what's your two more then?
Because I like to keep you guessing. I like to keep you guessing. The third one for me is the importance of understanding resilience, right? And importantly, that resilience is actually an individual thing. What I mean by that is really good leaders know ways to instill and drive individual resilience within their teams, knowing how to push, challenge, but also create opportunities for them to recover, rest in their own ways. Because this idea around learning and failure, again, looping back to something that you mentioned before, is we know it's not a one-off event, or we know that potentially, like in this COVID-based world that we're in now, people actually might be experiencing multiple failures. We're trying to pivot, find new ways of working, and we try technology format, doesn't work. Okay, great, we've got to pivot again. Or we try, okay, we're going to have everyone working from home. Okay, well, that worked a bit, but not great, so we've got to pivot back. There is this sort of continual change and adjustment that's taking place. And one of the things that is often forgotten is the resilience and the energy levels of the individuals involved. And if we're able to maintain and support that, well, then we actually end up being better at dealing with failure, funnily enough, because we have clearer minds to deal with things. We have more energy to be able to sort of loop back in. The actual taking care of that individual is often forgotten, and something leaders need to make sure they do.
Once again, another very brilliant point from you.
They can't all be. They can't all be brilliant.
Well, it's only episode 5.
Statistically impossible.
Well,
Statistically impossible.
It's only episode 5. We'll go downhill at some stage, I'm sure.
Right. I feel we're running out of material already.
I think we're full of
material, I should say. Brilliant material.
yeah. Well, one of the things that organisations can do and leaders can do in regards to assisting with that resilience, in regards to feeling comfortable about going forward and taking risk and dealing with failure when it does occur, is to set some really clear boundaries in regards to what we approach in regards to risk. And one of my concerns when I start talking about this, that we want to build failure tolerant organisations and leaders are okay with failure, what tends to happen if people haven't heard this concept before is their brain runs to the extreme. And that extreme is we just throw everything out and we just go for it. And anything's possible and we don't care. We'll deal with failure. But part of being failure tolerant is also about leaders managing critical parts of the risk. The leader has to do that as well as the team, but managing that. And the best example that I can think of is health and safety. Okay. And that has to be a boundary in regards to the risks that we're willing to take and the failures that we're willing to accept. Individuals' health and safety at a workplace, we're never going to be okay with failure there. Same with, if I'm developing a car seat, baby car seat, for example, as an organisation, we are not going to accept that children get hurt as a learning opportunity for us. That's setting some boundaries, that we just don't go run out and do whatever we want. We go, okay, we're willing to take whatever risks we want, but here's the thing, we do not compromise people's health and safety, whether it's ours or the client's. End of story. And that can roll out to things like financial decisions, board decisions, and also public perception as well, because they're the things that leaders need to really manage.
Being clear about your values, right? Being clear about the values that you stand for.
Yeah.
So that the opportunity to be creative, to be innovative, to try different things always needs to map back and align to your values.
So
yeah, I think that's a fair point. Parameters around that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because you know what human brains are like. When we talk about stuff, everyone just runs to extremes rather than finds that middle ground. So I'm really cautious about that. I don't know if you've heard of this term, but I haven't before we did a bit of research on this. Something called simultaneous management. Have you ever heard of that before?
Simultaneous management.
Simultaneous management.
I'm intrigued.
Basically, what some companies are doing is they're setting a goal for a product or a process. And once they've had real clarity around what they're trying to achieve, they send two separate teams off in different directions to achieve that. And what their belief is that if they do that and check in with each other now and again, the learnings from each of those extremes are going to give them a better process to reach that goal. So not only are we just going out there and hoping for the best, these organizations are actually setting structures in place that causes people to look at it in very different ways and ultimately they think is a real breeding ground or area of fertilization for really great ideas and techniques, which I think would be brilliant. I guess it's like that A/B testing that we see in social media as well.
Absolutely.
We're willing to fail a little bit over here because that can learn from that, and so on and so forth. So,
that's very clever.
And we got new words. Simultaneous
management.
All right.
Sure, that's going to be hashtagging pretty soon.
I'm betting that's not. I'm going with, Mr. Overachiever. Number 4. What is that?
Again, the fatigue is really starting to wear down on me with this extra point. The final one for me is what I call a mindset reset. And with that is challenging the mindset, one around, like you were talking about from the start, around how we view failures per se, rather than zero-sum game pieces to being, actual learning events and things like that. But also where I think leaders can actually invest some time is to be setting up the mindset around that things aren't always peaches and cream and happy, easy go kind of life that we lead. We don't live in a world of just continual success, is that it's always a bit up and down and erratic anyway. And interesting, I was having a chat with the manager today and he was talking about, he'd done some resilience work with his team about 12 months ago. And in there, as they were sitting down and sort of closing out some of their learnings around their resilience, around both from an individual level, but also as a team, he actually sat them down and said, okay, well, we will go through hard things together, and started the conversation around how they may deal with those hard things when they arrive. Interestingly, about 6 months later, COVID hit and it became very real for them. But that actual idea of setting up a mindset that obviously, and as you say it out loud, it makes perfect sense. Not always is life going to be easy, and not always are we going to go from success to success. There are going to be the ups and downs. So taking that time to actually reset that mindset with your team and saying, well, look, part of developing really powerful teams and really powerful organizations is actually going through some stuff together. And I think resetting that mindset can be really useful.
Anything else?
Oh, man, please. I feel like I can only really produce maybe 2 points next week with the amount of energy that I've invested this week.
Does that mean the next week after that you don't turn up or something like that?
Well, I might need some rest. I need to work on my resilience and have a break in between.
All right.
I reckon people have got a few good things that they can work on there.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is a pretty good one. Ash and I will be back next week to look at another topic in regards to leadership. If you've missed out on our previous weeks, please click on the link below and that will take you to our playlist on our YouTube channel. And if you have a topic or a question that you would like us to address, please use the contact details that are on your screen right now. And we would really enjoy answering the questions that you have or topics that you would like us to cover.
Absolutely. Challenge us, hey? Challenge us with something a bit out there.
Absolutely. We'll see if we can test our Ash's resilience. So thank you, Ash. Thank you, Ash. Well done, mate.
Mate, good work to you, Crofts. Pleasure as always to spend time with you.
And thank you for joining us, and we will be back next week.